لأجلك يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي، لأجلك يا بهية المساكن، يا زهرة المدائن، يا قدس يا قدس يا قدس يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي. عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد.
عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم،
ترحل كل يوم،
تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد.
يا ليلة الإسراء، يا درب من مروا إلى السماء، عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم وإنني أصلي. الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان،
الطفل في المغارة
وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان، يبكيان.
Mr. Royce, we can't hear you.
Hello and welcome to the 7th session for the Second International Palestine Conference at CIGA. I would like to introduce my colleague Ubaid Roof, who will be moderating the session today. Ubaid is a research fellow and editor at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, and he is assistant to the rector at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. He is an attorney by profession, a certified fraud examiner, and a certified Islamic finance executive. He got his law degree at Creighton University in the United States, and over the course of his Islamic finance career, he has been a practitioner and an Islamic finance platform and adapted the Islamic finance platform to be compliant with US accounting standards. In 2017, he was the Cambridge IFLP Islamic Finance Leadership. He has received the Islamic Finance Leadership Award. In law school, he was a research assistant to a world-renowned economist, Edward Morse, and mentored in constitutional law by US Supreme Court Justice, Mr. Justice Clarence Thomas. During his studies at Al-Quds, he was mentored by Nobel Prize laureate Robert Allman. Ubaid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Uwais. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Again, on behalf of CIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs, welcome everyone to our second Palestine conference. This conference is being broadcast from Turkey, a nation that is hosting more refugees than any nation in the world. We are not broadcasting from Palestine because our towns and villages have been stolen, including the village of my daughter's great-grandfather, the village Hamama, which was stolen in 1948. We have a wonderful selection of guests with experiences recently in experiencing censorship, in academia, in practice with what's happening in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Al-Quds, in what is called East Jerusalem. Many of our guests have been censored, and they will be talking about the apartheid regime and how it functions in academia, how it functions in education, how apartheid functions in the law, how it functions in the media, how it functions in culture. Our first guest will be Professor Rabab Abdelhadi, who is at San Francisco State University, in discussing apartheid industry functioning in academia and education. I'll introduce each panel member as we turn the floor to them. And so, Professor Rabab, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning. Good evening. I want to begin by acknowledging that San Francisco State University sits on stolen indigenous people's land, and this is really important, both in its own right and in terms of acknowledging what settler colonialism is all about and what we are here all about. Secondly, I want to thank Dr. Sami Al-Arian, CIGA, all the staff, all the people who are on screen and behind the screen at CIGA. It's really nice to be back. Also, thank to co-sponsors. In my preparation, I actually went through the 60 conference participants, and I counted at least half who have been targeted and censored at one point or another. I think if we actually calculate official scholars as well as public intellectuals, whom we call everybody public intellectual because we're engaged in public engagement of important matters, the number will rise. This is something that I would really like to even study more and take my time into learning about. And I hope everybody in the conference can actually share with me some of the experiences that might not be as well known. So I'm going to be speaking about the Israel lobby industry, and it is definitely an industry. I want to begin by a couple of issues about what it is. It is in addition to the registered Israel lobby, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is registered in Washington, DC, and I'm speaking about the United States context in particular. There are also multiple organizations that are very well organized, very well funded, by folks such as the multimillionaire, mega millionaire Sheldon Adelson, who passed away not long ago, but also some of the main democratic so-called liberal supporters like Hayim Sabban and others. And we will continue Jewish Community Relations Council, etc. They are very well supported. And the industry itself is not only consisting of Jewish Zionist organizations, but also include right-wing and Christian right as well. I'm going to be able to continue about it. So let me just talk about, and they are very much connected to US seats of power. Some of the organizations I will mention are self-explanatory. We don't have enough time to get into each one of them. There are theses and dissertations that are being written about it, but they include the Israel on Campus Coalition. I'm speaking particularly in the academy. AMCHA initiative, which actually seeks to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, targets scholar on the basis of terrorism, tries to invoke some phantom laws or whatever in order to bring down scholars. They haven't succeeded in any single one of their claims. Stand With Us, which is also an organization that has sued University of California, UCLA, has sued several universities on behalf of Zionist organizations. Simon Wiesenthal Center, which actually built the so-called Museum of Tolerance on the land of the Mamilla cemetery, the Manila cemetery, and actually they started targeting us back in 2013 over our Facebook post that I made. Anti-Defamation League, which claims to be a group that advocates against anti-Semitism and for the protection of Jews against hatred, but in fact actually has been, as one of the speakers yesterday elaborated, and has been established, involved in spying on many Palestinian, Arab, and non-Palestinian organizations like the NAACP, the ANC, the Iranian opposition, the Arab American University graduates, and thousands of many others. And Anti-Defamation League is also has been quoted and has been used as labeling Palestinian universities as terrorist universities. And that has been used by AMFA to try to undermine the collaborative agreement that we built with An-Najah National University in Palestine, and has been attacked again and again. Also, Anti-Defamation League is involved in a project that the Jewish Voice for Peace called the Deadly Exchange, in which Anti-Defamation League brings U.S. police, and I would call colonial securitized apparatus, along with Israeli military, to co-train together. So many of the people who have actually participated, including the former chief of Ferguson, where Michael Brown, the black kid, was assassinated in 2014, was trained in Israel. There is also Zionist Organization of America. I'm not going to spend time on that. There is David Horowitz, a Freedom Center, who has been engaged in attacking Black Lives Matter, in attacking Sanctuary Movement, in attacking multiple other anti-immigrant organizations, and has actually engaged, is very well known for the posters campaign that he posted on our campus against me and my students and my colleagues, as well as on other campuses around the United States. Actually called Angela Davis, a terrorist supporter, called me and our colleagues as quote unquote Hamas terrorist supporter, engaged, including Students for Justice in Palestine, engaged in propagating Jew hatred, and that's the hashtag, in collaboration with the Canary Mission. I think people know what the Canary Mission is all about. I don't want to take time now for it. There is the Campus Watch, Middle East Forum, which was founded, and by the way, David Horowitz is labeled as a leading Islamophobe by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Campus Watch, Middle East Forum, founded by Daniel Pipes, who's also discredited and also hailed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a leading Islamophobe. I should say that it's very, very interesting, because the Campus Watch Middle East Forum claim that they're not focusing particularly on Israel, even though they do, but on what is supposed to be the national interest of the United States. So one of their main claims now is building on the Trump so-called act against anti-Semitism in 2019, demanding that every single university that has scholars or students or activists that speak about or advocate for justice for Palestine, which they claim is part of Jewish hatred, should lose all its funding from any kind, with medicine, sciences, or anything of the sort. Daniel Pipes, interestingly, and the 50th anniversary of what happened at Harvard and the Vietnam War, actually posted a big article priding himself on spying on anti-Vietnam War student activists. And there is also the Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, which also has been discredited and engaged in a big scandal in the journal Israeli Studies, because they've created, they didn't use the journal for the studies that they're supposed to, but they use it actually in terms of propagate and advocate as a propaganda piece, Hasbara for Israel. And in addition to that, there is the Academic Engagement Network, which has been created by the former chancellor of the University of California. It is now, the executive director is Ellman, who is at Syracuse University, who the American Engagement Network has been engaged very much in many campaigns, including several campaigns earlier and ongoing against any scholarship, any students, any activism on campuses in terms of justice in for Palestine and connecting with it. The other aspect of this is that this is a very right-wing. The Israel lobby is connected with very right-wing, parallels and correlates right-wing groups. So including with the Israel lobby, I will include groups like Campus Reform, which has been founded since the 50s, and is funded by millions of dollars, and has been actually a subject of expose recently by American Association of University Professors. There is in the media, and I'm not going to talk about other things that my colleagues will talk about, the Washington Examiner, which I'm sure my colleague Rawan might want to attest. There are also in Congress, Doug Lambone, for example, from Colorado Springs, was one of the people who wrote letters to the Department of Homeland Security and the Justice Department and other departments in the United States, demanding that my colleague Tomomi Kinakawa and I be investigated on charges of material support for terrorism, following up on what the Lawfare Project propagated the campaign after September 23rd, when we put together an open classroom webinar on whose narrative, gender justice and resistance in Palestine, with 4 scholars in conversation with Leila Khalid. 2 of them are actually Jewish scholars, including Ronnie Kesriels from South Africa, who was part of the ANC, Laura Whitehorn, a former prisoner, and a very well-known Black liberation activist Seiko Odinga, who spent 33 years in prison, as well as the director of the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit University, Rula Abu Daho, in order for us to also speak about what does it mean to have education in Palestine, or what does it mean to have right to education in Palestine. Lawfare targeted us actually specifically, saying that this is something that has to do, that you can, they claimed that it was about Leila Khalid, but in an NPR interview, actually, Brooke Goldstein said that, well, Leila Khalid can speak wherever she wants, but this cannot be part of the institutionalization of things on campus, which I'll speak about in a little bit. And all of these groups have been very instrumental, including Brooke Goldstein, in the so-called anti-Semitism act that Trump has passed in December 2019. Also part of the lobby will be what we call the Christian Zionist groups. For example, Christians United for Israel has been actually quite instrumental in this, and they were also Christian Zionists. If people we want to connect this with Palestine, have been very much involved in pushing and advocating for Trump, along with Jewish Zionists and other right-wingers, to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I'm not going to speak more about that because I think people know about it. So what's the goal? What is the real goal of the Israel lobby? The Israel lobby goal is to reinforce Israel's normalcy, not as a settler colonial, racist apartheid state, to shield Israel from accountability like any other state, to apologize and justify Israel's actions, and to present the exceptionality of Israel as a miracle that is modernizing this backward region, that is civilized against savage Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, that abides by the rule of law, that's actually a democratic country, if for a few problems and so on, that is a liberator of women, of the environment, of queers, of workers, and of course of Jews. In other words, washing, and people call pink washing, faith washing, gender washing, green washing, washing what Israel is really all about, and what is the essence of Israel that is inherently rehabilitated, but to actually make it sound as if any problems, any violence, any discrimination, all of it is random, is isolated, is accidental. We are reminded recently by the Israeli military spokespeople who keep saying that actually when they bomb Gaza, they're trying to avoid civilians and so on, except facts speak louder than that. What are the features of the Israel lobby? There in the Israel lobby industry, first of all, it's very, very important, as I said, to connect. This is very much connected with Palestine, with also other developments and movements, whether we talk about in the US or whether we're talking about internationally. So none of it happens in isolation, including at our own campus, which I'm not going to have much time to speak about because I want to stick to the time, so we all could get to speak. What they are now, what the Israel's lobby objectives is, take no prisoners. Maybe in the past they were willing to kind of think about things and so on. Today is take no prisoners. The attacks are intended to distract from what we are trying to do, divert what we're doing, recenter the Israeli narrative and Zionist claims, delegitimize what we're trying to do, and what is considered as scholarship, by constructing those of us who speak up as controversial, as engaged with terrorism, as anti-Semitic, and if one thing doesn't work, they'll do another thing. So we can speak about that more, and my colleagues will speak about that. The other aspect that I think it's really, really important is that they are trying to also place limits on what is it that we can or we cannot do in our own scholarship, on in our own education. And one of the things that has been actually quite insistent in what they're trying to do, and because we don't have a lot of time, I want to focus on it, is that trying to prevent, delegitimize and prevent this discussion, the study of Palestine as a question of justice, as part and parcel of decolonizing the curriculum, and by extension erase the question of Palestine, Palestinian connections to the land and their life and history and so on, and to try to completely silence it, especially in the academy. And I'm going to mention two examples. One is what we have been seeing recently with the California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, and this is an initiative across the state of California that will engage in this in the discussion of ethnic studies, including Palestine and other questions of justice, which I can speak about later on. And now we have multiple states, by the way, by right-wingers actually banning what they call critical race theory, which we are inspired by in our work as we discuss Palestine as part and parcel of what we say the indivisibility of justice, as framed in our project on teaching Palestine. So they are very much interested in plugging the institutionalization, and actually, and then if that doesn't work, what they do is they do it in the dark. The reason they do it in the dark and they do it behind doors, one is because if it goes in public, it actually becomes a huge scandal. And this is something that they are doing with the universities, trying to prevent the universities from actually hosting and engaging, as I mentioned already with Campus Watch. Now there is a very active attempt, and as the university, public university, become more privatized and depend more on donors, combined with the existing normalized discourse of Islamophobia, Orientalism, racism, anti-Arab discrimination, anti-Palestinian discrimination, and Islamophobia, the university administration are very hospitable and very much willing. So, for example, in our own university, it's not only that the Zionists have also signaled our Facebook pages and so on. I've actually been demanded how much more time do I have? I'm just trying to.
About 5 minutes, Professor.
Perfect, excellent. Thank you so much. Okay. So I actually thought I had less, so this is really great. So our university administration actually was very much engaged in targeting our Facebook page since the Zionists have targeted us. So and the university administration has been very much involved in trying to silence what's going on. So I'm giving a couple of examples. For example, we had a big teaching in 2018 called Palestine at SFSU. And our Facebook page was monitored. The Dean of Students, who had just been to a visit to Israel in 2016, all paid expenses to Israel, noticed activity on they've been monitoring our Facebook page, called the dean. Our dean said that she needs to ensure the room where we were holding it, because risk management of the university is concerned. And just to be very transparent about it, the risk management enterprise services are actually headed by one of the leading Zionists on campus. We argued against it. We said you should not be insuring a room where we're having something about Palestine, but it constructs Palestine as dangerous, as terroristic, as a danger to students and so on. And nonetheless, she refused. I've appealed and appealed and appealed. The Facebook page has been targeted more historically, but specifically when I posted a critique of my university president who welcomed Zionists to campus, and I wrote, "Dear colleague," letter included in that this is an offense to Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, and our Jewish sisters and brothers for whom Israel does not want to speak. I was contacted by the dean 3 times to take down the post. The provost emailed me twice threatening with disciplinary measures. It's very interesting because I received this while we were in Palestine on a Teaching Palestine trip, traveling from one place to the other to hear what was going on with Palestine, which is something we've been doing again and again. And then after I refused to take it down on the basis that this is McCarthyist and this is silencing and this is violation of my academic freedom and freedom of speech. Nonetheless, the university president himself, who actually welcomed Zionists, condemned me, and this is none other than the person who actually also went on all-paid trip to Israel and switched his position about being open to us, to our program, and so on. Afterwards, condemned speech, denied me travel authorization to Lebanon, prosecuted a Palestinian student along with the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Israeli consulate, which for posting things that they thought was inappropriate, while they actually, the same university down the line did not do the same thing to a neo-Nazi student who was in my Palestine class. And I don't have time to share all of this stuff. The chancellor of the university condemned us. The Zionist groups led by Amcha and others issued a statement of 60 quote unquote Jewish organization, and the list keeps growing. It becomes 80, it becomes over 100, and so on. So every single chapter of Israel on Campus Coalition or Maccabi or they post and so on. And then we started receiving more death threats, and some of them are actually go home. Some of them are very similar to what Ilhan Omar has received and Rashida Tlaib. Some of them have to do with the S-hole countries, like the way the previous president said. Some of them actually have very gendered and sexualized items, like what the posts against Gigi and Bella Habib and against PAC USA in New Jersey. So this has been going on, and now the most recent thing is that we tried to launch again our Zoom open classroom that was silenced by Zoom in September on the basis that it violates terms of service for Zoom. But and we actually, and material support for terrorism, this is all the legal scholars, this is not even true. But the reason that actually happened is because there is an app by the Israeli government. I believe one of my colleagues spoke about that yesterday. It's called ACT-IL. ACT-IL basically bragged that they posted 19,000 messages to Facebook, to Zoom, to YouTube, and we believe to Eventbrite and so on, to shut it down. We tried to mount the same event again on April 23rd under the title, Whose Narratives? What Freedom Speech for Palestine? What freedom of speech for Palestine? Along with our colleagues at UC Merced, Sean Malloy, ACT-IL actually posted, and this time the act was sponsored by the Herzliya Center, and anybody who knows about Palestine studies knows about the Herzliya Center as being a very important strategic center for Israel, by Maccabi, by, of course, Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs was one of the groups that are doing it. The last point I want to say, and by the way, just so we don't forget, Naftali Bennett was Minister of Education at some point. I'll move on. There are a lot of connections. The ties are very connections. So what are they trying to do? Part of the reason that they have a serious problem with us is because what we do is we open our classrooms to the community and open to community to the classroom. We do not believe that scholarship can only be done in the classroom. We believe that scholarship has to be done by everybody, and that the indigenous knowledges that come from our communities, from our people, and on which many of the scholars actually build their careers and so on, they're very, very important for the students to be engaged in. We don't treat students as stupid children who do not know what's going on. We treat them as mature adults who are able and willing to carve new movements for change. We also engage in delegations to Palestine. And I would just want to give a shout out. On Wednesday, we're going to have the 10th anniversary of the Indigenous and Women of Color Feminist Delegation that included many leading scholars. I'll mention Angela Davis because people know her, but there is so many other amazing scholars that actually led down the line to the National Women's Studies Association adopting a position on Palestine and supporting BDS. And we also tried to culminate all of that in a study abroad program in Palestine. In other words, is what the Israel lobby industry, with all of them together and with their right-wing allies who are united in their project and so on, what they're trying to do is trying to prevent the institutionalization of programs of this as the legitimate form of inquiry in the academy, intellectual inquiry, decolonizing knowledge. And we are very much inspired by the 1968 strike at SFSU, by Black Student Union, Third World Liberation Front. So we're actually constructed within an internationalist, third worldist kind of perspective, not in terms of this is a foreign issue that we do not need to carry about. They've been really trying to silence us. They tried to shut down everything. They canceled our classes. They reduced our classes to less than 60% of what we have. They canceled Palestine-centered classes last fall. They claimed that COVID is a budget issue, so they used it to create facts on the ground and so on. We say we will not be silenced. We will continue to educate. We will continue to teach. We will continue to research. We will continue to advocate for justice in for Palestine as part of the indivisibility of justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rabab. I was familiar from the news of some of your Zoom classes that have been censored and shut down. I found it absolutely ridiculous. Also, unfortunately, familiar with what you're saying, the pattern that scholarship about Palestinians and Palestine frequently is not viewed as a scholastic or as a academic. It's not viewed academically. As an example, I did a ethnographic study of Palestinian refugees, and I submitted an abstract which was accepted at a UK university. And in my abstract, I was strategic and I did not mention it was Palestinian refugees. Then when the time came asking me, am I still coming to the conference? Do I have more information? Do I have the full paper? Then I mentioned, yes, I do. It's about Palestinian refugees. They immediately revoked my acceptance to the conference and said, oh, we're sorry. This is activism. What you did is not scholarship and you can't come to the conference.
I'm actually very familiar with that. So yeah.
Absolutely ridiculous. How is it that a professional level, personal ethnographic study, they categorize unilaterally as activism and disinvite me? By the way, that was University of Leeds. I will oppose that university in everything until they make that correct. I will boycott anything related to the University of Leeds. Moving on, our next speaker, we're changing the order a little bit. We'll talk about apartheid in the media. Mr. Rami Khouri is at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. Dr. Khouri, you might like this. I have on my social media, I have a cat. It's a Palestinian cat. People like cat pictures on the internet, so I made a Palestinian cat to see if it's censored. And so if my cat is censored, then I know that they'll be censoring other things. This is Smokey, the Palestinian cat. Please enlighten us on what's happening in the realm of social media.
Thank you. I wanted to thank CIGA and all the other people who've been involved in arranging this for having me. I'm happy and honored to be with my esteemed colleagues. My title was to talk about apartheid in the media, and I took it as the general media, not just the social media only. Social media is the most dramatic thing happening today, but the fascinating thing about all dimensions of what's going on in Palestine, hang on, let me just put on my timer so that I don't take too much time.
No problem. I'll let you know when you have a few minutes left, and remember, speak slowly for our Turkish translators who are working very hard.
Yes. The fascinating thing about what's going on in the entire realm of Palestine, Israel, the struggle between Zionism and Arabism, is that there are significant changes happening in virtually every realm. And it is so clear in the media. So I'm going to focus on the media, but I'll mention once or twice how this is part of a bigger transformation that's starting to happen. We're in the early stages of what I think is a historical moment that corrects many of the distortions, the imbalances, the omissions, and the crimes of the past that Zionism has implemented in cahoots with many of its partners around the world. But the earliest days of the Zionist project, starting in around 1900, the first 2 centuries were critical, leading to the Balfour Declaration and then the Mandate in Palestine. Those were critical first steps, and they happened because the Zionist movement, which was a very small movement back then, essentially was able to make the Palestinians, from the beginning of this conflict, invisible people. If you go back and read accounts in the media, and I've read accounts by journalists who were reporting in Europe and Palestine in the 20s and 30s, where the Palestinian view didn't get across. The Palestinians just didn't exist as people. These were Arabs or Muslims or something, Levantines. And the Zionist views were paramount because the Zionist leaders, with some of their European and later American colleagues like Brandeis and others, but starting in Europe, they were able to really convince the European, British mostly, and then others, they convinced them that the Zionist goals in Palestine to create a national home, which was of course always designed as a state, but they called it a national home because it was a form of intellectual trickery to get around any obstacles, that they convinced them that this was a moral imperative, and also that this would be a strategic advantage to the West to have an ally like a Zionist state or something like that, a Jewish home. But at the same time, the Palestinians were invisible. This is what's in, and they were able to essentially keep the Palestinians from being represented in the media, or when they were represented later on in the 30s and 40s, the pattern was that they would be portrayed in most of the Western media, not all of it, but most of it, as dangerous people, extremists. And this was a tactic that the Zionist movement has used very successfully for the last century, which is just now, literally now in the last 6 months, starting to break down. And the tactic is to equate the Palestinians with any radical movement of the day. Back in the early days, it was the Nazis, and then it was the communists, and then it was the oil boycotters, and then it was the terrorists, and now it's Iran and the ISIS. And so at every stage, if you go back and analyze the media portrayal of the Palestinians, which very much reflects Zionist manipulation and lobbying, made the Palestinians either invisible or dangerous. And this was one of the big reasons for the success of the Zionist movement, that convinced, just barely, but convinced enough Western powers to support it and vote for it in 1947. And you know, history then ran its course. And until just a few years ago, it was very difficult to get major Palestinian views into the mainstream media. You would get one nice documentary on maybe on PBS or something, or possibly on BBC or somewhere in Europe. And against that, you'd have 55 pro-Israeli documentaries. So the media landscape was wildly pro-Israeli. And this was because of really effective Zionist lobbying and manipulation, including using threats of boycotts, of advertising, if people did too many things that showed the Palestinians as real people, etc. So the kinds of things they're saying that the Palestinians shouldn't do, we shouldn't have boycott and divestment, but they were allowed to do it in their case. So the important thing is that this is all changing. Social media that came about maybe 15, 20 years ago started this process of breaking down the essential media connection and political connection. It's very hard to separate the media apartheid from the other apartheid forms of Zionist policymaking. But the stranglehold, virtual stranglehold that the Zionist movement had on major Western media started to break down when social media came along, because suddenly the ability to keep the Palestinians as invisible people in Europe or North America or Asia or Africa or other places, they couldn't do that anymore because everybody had access to the media. The second thing is that Palestinian activists, civil society movements, started to act much on their own because their leadership had essentially collapsed. The PLO about 15, 20 years ago essentially collapsed, and after the Oslo Agreement and the PA was founded, there was no serious national leadership, with a few little exceptions here and there. like a few things that they did at the UN. But the bulk of the media activism was done by private Palestinians, journalists, academics, activists, business people, incredible amount of dynamism as the Palestinians saw that they were able to communicate to the world through social media. And then the BDS movement started, and the BDS movement was a great focal point for mobilizing allies and people around the world. And all of these things came together. So it's no surprise that the third point I want to make is that when this social media movement kept expanding, the traditional control or the traditional influence of Zionist forces on Western media started to weaken a little bit. Then the Israeli and Zionist movements tried a new strategy, which was to criminalize expressions of Palestinian support or just explaining the facts of Palestine. Palestine free speech was made into anti-Semitism, into dangerous extremism, into something that was harmful to children and to adults and to Jews and to other people. And they tried to stop the BDS movement using legal mechanisms, whether at state level, local level in Europe and North America, or at the national level as much as they could. But the problem then became that when the movement against free speech and the movement to control Palestinian expressions of either explaining facts or mobilizing support in the media, when people tried to stop that, Zionists tried to stop that through law or intimidation, it ran up against the American First Amendment guarantee of free speech. So for the first time since the beginning of the conflict, we felt in the media sphere a confrontation, not between Zionism and Arabism, but between Zionism and Western constitutionalism. And of course, Western constitutionalism was going to win because several other things started to happen at the same time. The historic turning point, I believe, and I'm exaggerating a little bit because I'm a journalist, not an academic like most of you. So this is how I make my living. I exaggerate a little bit, but the historic turning point was that day when Jacob, the settler, the Zionist colonial settler from Long Island, was taking Mun al-Qud's house, and she confronted him, and it was caught on social media, and it was relayed live and replayed over and over and over again. For the first time since 1900, the world could see Zionist colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid supported by the powers of the Jewish Israeli state. They could watch that live. This never happened before. We had instances in the past where Israeli Zionist atrocities attacking refugee camps and civilian facilities in Lebanon and in Gaza and all over Palestine, murdering people. Those were reported, but they were never seen live on TV. The West had never seen a Zionist colonial thug live, and they did. And this is Jacob. Jacob, I forget his last name. Jacob, the Long Island settler who was trying to take, who had already taken part of Mun al-Qud's house. And then what happened? Of course, you had the Aqsa situation, the Israelis firing bullets and tear gas inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then massive Palestinian resistance and support, young Palestinians mostly. And this is important to note, that the thousands and thousands of Palestinians who went to the Aqsa Mosque and to Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan to protect these places were going there on the basis of their own local mobilization. They were not going there on the basis of leadership by their national political leadership, because the national political leadership had vanished. Abu Mazen was nowhere to be seen. The PLO was nowhere to be seen. The Jerusalem leadership had already been put in jail by the Israelis or shot or expelled. And therefore, there was a spontaneous mass movement of support by Palestinians to protect their mosques, to protect their identity, to protect their homes, to protect their neighborhoods, to protect their very existence. And this was a moment that, and then of course you had the Gaza fighting with Hamas and Israel trading attacks against each other. But when this happened in Sheikh Jarrah, all of a sudden, when the Western world, or the world as a whole, I focus on the Western world because that's mostly where the Zionist movement manipulated the media and succeeded. But when the world saw Israeli settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing in real time on TV or on their cell phones, then the opportunities for Palestinians to speak in the media became much bigger. And thousands of Palestinians, including many of us here today, were able to tell their story directly to the media. I'm now in Boston and Cambridge for a while. I'm going to Beirut and Amman next week, but I've been watching this from the US, and it was extraordinary to see the ability of Palestinians to express themselves directly without intermediation of editors or PR agents. And there was suddenly an opportunity for the Palestinians to resist physically in Jerusalem, to resist intellectually in the media, and you had political leaders in the American Congress and European Parliament, at local community levels all over the US, people mobilized, and huge movements were mobilized for support with marches and demonstrations. I attended some in Boston that were quite extraordinary. And when this happened, the whole global discussion about Zionism in the media, about Israel-Palestine, the whole global discussion changed. It suddenly became a discussion that talked about, of course, it always talked about Israel's right to defend itself. That was nothing new. But suddenly there was talk about Israel as apartheid. There was talk about 1947-48 ethnic cleansing. There was talk about Deir Yassin and Lifta and all these other places that we know about, but the world never heard of. And there was talk about Balfour. How the hell did the English give away a piece of land that they had no sovereignty or control or mandate to do anything with? And there was talk of Israeli war crimes. So suddenly the entire media discourse changed in the span of essentially 2 weeks because of what had been seen live on television by people all over the world. And this is important because the historical success of the Zionist movement is very much linked to quiet, behind closed doors, personalized diplomacy with people like Chaim Weizmann and the Rothschilds and Brandeis and other people who went to Western leaders and convinced them to do support for the Zionist movement, and they succeeded. Suddenly, that doesn't work anymore. When you had elected congressional leaders in the US speaking in Congress about this, and you had Rashida Tlaib talking to the American president on the tarmac of an airport near Detroit, personally telling her about her teta. It's incredible. The media captured this historic turning that started to happen. It's not a 180-degree turn, but we're in the midst of a historic transformation in which the Palestinians have access to the media and can tell their own story. The Zionist lies and exaggerations and omissions and distortions are mostly being blunted because people could see the reality on TV, not just Jacob, but then the attacks in Gaza and then the follow-up stories. Some of the things that came up in the New York Times and other places were quite extraordinary, unprecedented. And there's going to be more and more of this. So the question, of course, is the media doesn't make policy. The media reflects policy. So the media is a really powerful reflection today of the fact that Israeli Zionist apartheid is now widely acknowledged, widely confronted, and widely challenged by global mobilizations between people in Palestine, Arab Islamic countries, and countries all over the world. We've never had this situation. All of this is unprecedented. And I'm just praying that the Palestinian leadership and other leaderships can recognize the opportunity there is now to mobilize these incredible forces for good, for justice, for righteousness, for dignity, for human rights. We're not talking about killing the Israelis or throwing them into the sea, as they will tell people. By the way, there was a fascinating personal experience I had. I gave a lecture during this whole period at a university. It was online. And after I finished the lecture, a few days later, an Israeli official in the United States called the university and said, "Oh, I want equal time." So they invited him, which is the right thing to do. I told them, let's have a debate. But they don't want to debate. The Israelis don't want to debate. They just want to give their view. So the Israeli official gave his presentation the next week. I cataloged it all. I'm writing a long article about this. It is a compendium of every single falsehood, lie, distortion, omission, and exaggeration that the Israelis have used, Zionists have used for the last 120 years. It is unbelievable. And when you watch the Israeli spin doctors in action, this is what we're seeing over and over and over again, and it just doesn't work anymore. So they're worried. I'm sure they don't quite know what to do, and there are thousands of people using the law, using politics, using social mobilization, presenting the Palestinian case all the time, saying we just want justice. We want justice, and the Israelis who live there can stay there, but they can't stay as colonial settlers. We've got to have our rights, and we can all live together in some format that we will negotiate. So the media, I'll stop here, the media is a critical mirror of the many political changes that are taking place. And I think we need to pay more attention to it to understand how to continue mobilizing and articulating for our cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami. Very interesting and enlightening. I'm hoping that some people are watching this that aren't familiar with some of these issues and are learning from this. For those that don't know what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, it's a neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem. Rami referred to a woman, Muna Al-Kurd, who has lived there her entire life, whose parents lived there in their home that has been stolen from a gentleman from Brooklyn, an American,
Long Island,
who's Israeli now, returning to his homeland. And in the last 24 hours, it's been interesting to watch Muna Al-Kurd as her posts have now been censored and deleted and cited as violating Facebook's policy for bullying and harassment. What's interesting about this, she's not making commentary. She's not doing anything other than having a camera and showing what is happening. So how is it that facts on the ground with no commentary, with no editing, is labeled as bullying and censor and harassment? So is it that Israelis are bullying and harassing Palestinians and they don't want people to see it? Where's the bullying and the harassment? Is it the tech apps that the Professor Rabab mentioned, that Israel will send 20,000 simultaneous complaints to LinkedIn and Facebook saying, I'm being bullied, I'm being bullied, I'm being bullied, until they flag it and remove it?
Can I just add one last comment before I leave on that? And this is, again, a reflection of what's going on. When these attempts in social media happen to silence Palestinian or pro-Palestinian voices, or not just pro-Palestinian, pro-equal rights voices, pro-justice voices, now you get a tremendous pushback from Palestinians and Westerners who challenge these things. They go talk to Facebook, they go to the courts, they go into the media. So no longer can the Zionists do this kind of intimidation and get away with it. Now there's pushback. And the second thing I want to mention, when I close my video, you'll see that my office cat in Beirut is with me as well.
Yes, cats are great. Yes, it's hard to censor cats, and so wonderful we got a cat. Thank you, Rami, for your contribution. Our next guest will be, excuse me, let me open my app. I don't want to mispronounce your name from memory. Will be Miss Rawan Daman, a media consultant and filmmaker in Jordan. She has extensive experience. After her presentation will be our last presenter, Miss Huwaida Araf. Rawan, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Abed. Thanks for Professor Sami Al-Aryan and CIGA team for organizing this and bringing us together with dear Rabab, Rami, and looking forward to Huwaida. Thanks a lot also for the translators who's translating to Arabic and Turkish. And we are being watched on more than 300 people on YouTube live now. So thanks to everybody who turned to discuss with us and get this story of Palestine the most exposure needed. I enjoyed very much attending the first international conference on Palestine in April 2019, and it was one of the best conferences on Palestine, and I have attended many in the States, Europe, and in the region. And Professor Sami and the team are always careful in choosing what to present in the conferences, including the second international conference on Palestine, where the main theme is challenging apartheid in Palestine, reclaiming the narrative, and formulating a vision, which I think is very important, how to reclaim the narrative of Palestine and build on that for the future. I'll speak for around 15 to 18 minutes concerning culture, and mainly cities and books. So Palestinian history is closely connected with the fate of its cities. And this is different from the main Palestinian narrative that always connected the Palestine history with the villages, talking about destroyed villages. I know Dr. Salman Abu Sitteh was, speaking at the conference on the first day, and his atlas documented 500 or more destroyed villages in Palestine in 1948. But rarely in the history of Palestine, we focus on the cities, and I'll try to explain why we need to. Haifa, Akka, Akko, and Jaffa, Yafa, once served as the cultural centers of Palestinian life. During the 1948 ethnic cleansing, known as Al-Nakba, Israel drove most Palestinians out of these cities. And most of that even happened before middle of May 1948. So they were very keen about targeting cities, including Tiberias, Bisan, and all the other cities, Safad, for example, that usually people in history books don't mention enough. And Palestinian culture suffered a devastating blow due to that. The Zionist strategy was, and still, to undermine Palestinian urban cultural identity. Zionists saw that Palestinian cities were a danger to their overall aims. That's why they waged a brutal war against the cities and the Palestinian culture. Historically, Palestine served as the cultural crossroads of the Arab world. Even targeting Palestine, one of it is because of its geography that was really discussed in our first conference. In the early 20th century, agriculture and trade prospered. Urban life blossomed with theater, music, and literature, cinema. Palestinian cities shared close economic and cultural ties with other Arab capitals like Cairo, Beirut, and Damascus. Now it's like a dream for Rami to travel from Beirut to Akka in his car. It's like less than an hour drive, but that's a dream that people used to do on a weekly basis in Palestine pre-1948. Jaffa served as Palestine's commercial hub. Its stored port has been used since biblical times as a gateway to the Mediterranean Sea. In the 19th and early 20th century, Jaffa boasted an array of successful businesses. Factories produced everything from orange crates to soap to olive oil. Most of Palestine's newspapers and books were printed and published in Jaffa. The city was vibrant, prosperous, and wealthy. Palestine's cities were all destroyed in 1948. All of them. This was a clear Zionist plan, as the Zionist propaganda claims that Palestine had no cultural heritage. The fact that there was cultural activity in Palestinian cities is the strongest proof of the existence of a Palestinian people in Palestine. Palestine's thriving urban centers challenged the Zionist narrative that held Palestine was a land without a people to a people without a land. On the contrary, Palestinian cities were at the forefront of Arab civilization and culture. The reality directly contradicted the myth that the establishment of a Jewish state in the heart of the Arab world would be a civilizing force. And this is very much used until today, portraying Israel as a cultural, technology, and democracy in the region. In the wake of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, Zionists sought to strip cities of their Palestinian identity, erasing Palestine's cultural heritage in the process. The Nakba was deliberately planned to destroy the Palestinian existence. So when the Zionist forces captured Jaffa and Haifa in April 1948, while the British mandate was still in effect, the vast majority of Palestinians were driven out of those cities. So, for example, Haifa, 70,000 people, only 3,000 people were still in the city after April 1948. Those few Palestinian families that stayed there were forced into barbed wire fence areas like a prison. So overnight, Jaffa, the heart of Palestine, stopped beating. An entire way of life was lost. Merchants were denied access to their shops. Families were prevented from returning to their homes, which were subsequently looted by Zionists. Israel portrayed Palestinians to the rest of the world as uncultured peasants. And unfortunately, some Palestinians even and pro-Palestinians speak always about the uneducated farmers and peasants. And regarding that, Nakba even was there because people did not know. Or many people knew about the Zionists' plans, maybe not on the secret documents that we now know, but at least intellectuals wrote a lot about this in newspapers and books. The Zionists implied Palestinian refugees would merge into neighboring Arab countries and that Palestinian culture would quietly dissolve. So the denial of a culture is very much connected and very strongly to the Palestinian right of return. It will be very difficult, maybe impossible, to completely reclaim Palestinian culture without its historic cities, because most Palestinians alive today were born after 1948. They have no tangible connection to their heritage beside the stories passed down from their elders. Palestine's major cities are now Israeli ones, and that's a serious problem because Jaffa, Haifa, even Nazareth are not allowed to be real cities. This also applies even to Palestinian cities in the occupied West Bank, even to Nablus and Hebron and Ramallah, which are all of them more towns than cities and countrysides mentality and suburbs of the Israeli economic, really. This also applies, unfortunately, to Jerusalem, which is deprived from being a city, let alone being the capital to the Palestinians. A quick small story about a businessman in Java that was working with the woods with Slovenia in the 30s in Palestine. He worked there, he used to take the ship and go to Slovenia from Jaffa port. And after 1948, he was expelled with his family to Beirut in Lebanon. In 1948, he had this big business, wood coming from Slovenia to Jaffa. And this thing, the ship with the woods arrived to the port, but the money he needed to send there was never received. He never used these woods, and in reality, he was expelled, and the Zionists looted those ship of woods. And the head of the factory there in Slovenia never received his money for the wood that he sent. A few years later, in 1951, after he worked in Lebanon and compiled the money, he sent this letter to the head of the factory in Slovenia with the money for that wood that they never got any money for in 1948. And this is a story I heard from the daughter of the factory in Slovenia. When Nakba is mentioned, ethnic cleansing of people, cleansing their history and culture. Professor Pape have been all the time speaking about this, and I'm very glad that the conference honored him at the beginning. It also means, but a lesser known aspect of the expulsion is and works of art. Rarely it is mentioned the story of the systematic looting of tens of thousands of Palestinian books in 2021. If we visit the library of the Hebrew University, we can see there the books that were taken from the homes of well-known figures, such as Palestinian educator and visionary, really, Khalil Sakakini, amongst others. Even with Khalil Sakakini handwritten notes and dedication on his own books. So the Israeli library cataloged those books under the code AP, which stood for abandoned property until today. Although the looting of Palestinian books are not only the destroyed villages, and to build a city in Palestine, maybe under Israeli occupation, even if we can, and rethink about building the city in Palestine after the Zionist movement, because there will be a day that there will be no Zionist movement. Highlighting intellectuals, both men and women, in the theater, music, books, cinema, even in the 30s and 40s, and today is vital in our struggle to reclaim our narrative back. I would like to share with everybody, and I'll put those links I'll put the links here. Okay, for 2 documentaries, and then I'll show a 1-minute video. So I would advise interested to watch a documentary by Ramiz Qazmouz from Haifa called Lost Cities of Palestine, Haifa, Nazareth, and Jaffa. It's a very nice, well-done documentary available in English, Spanish, Turkish. I'll put also the Turkish link and Bosnian. Also a great documentary, The Great Book Robbery, that documented this appropriation of Palestinian books. Hope this sound will work. So Ubaid, just confirm to me that you can hear this.
Yes, I hear it.
سنة 48 تم القضاء على المدينة الفلسطينية لتكريس الدعاوى الصهيونية بشأن أن فلسطين هي أرض جدباء من الناحية الثقافية، من ناحية حراك المدينة الفلسطينية، لأن أكثر شيء يمكن أن يبرهن على وجود شعب فلسطيني في فلسطين هو المدينة الفلسطينية، هو الإنتاج الثقافي الذي كان يبدعه الأدباء والمثقفون في إطار المدينة الفلسطينية.
الغالبية الساحقة اليوم من الفلسطينيين في إسرائيل ولدوا بعد 48 بعد النكبة، وهم لم يعرفوا ولم يشاهدوا أو يتلمسوا تجربة المدينة الفلسطينية لأنها انقضى عليها في 48 مع النكبة.
احنا ولدنا وعشنا في فضاء محدود لدرجة أننا لم نستشعر الخسارة. من لم يعش فلسطين قبل 48 وولد إلى فضاء وحيز محدود ومجزأ وسقف واطي لم يستشعر الخسارة.
الجرح الفلسطيني ومحاولة محو الذاكرة واضح جدا في الحيز الفلسطيني، في الحيز المدني، في الحيز اليومي تبع الفلسطيني بالشارع، بالدكاني، بالمنطقة الثقافية، بالمعهد الثقافي، بمعهد الموسيقى، لأنه كان في هاي الأمور كلياتها ألغيت.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Rowan. And thank you for the links to the documentaries. I put them on my watch list and look forward to watching that. Our last presenter for this session, reminder as well that there's another session after this one that will begin 15 minutes after this one ends. Our last presenter for this session is Huwaida Raf. Huwaida, welcome. Happy Monday.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to CIGA for inviting me to participate in this prestigious conference. Of course, to Dr. Sami Al-Aryan and to everybody that had a role in putting this conference together. And of course, to my fellow panelists. I'm really honored to be in this space with all of you. I'd like to start, like Professor Rabab, by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from what's now called the state of Michigan in the United States, but which sits on the beautiful ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe people, known as the Three Fires Confederacy, or the United Nations of Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Powhatan tribes. As Professor Rabab explained, land acknowledgement is really important, and it is in the United States is becoming more customary to see, not as much as we would like, but it is becoming a little more prevalent, specifically in progressive spaces, in university settings. And this is critical for this country, the United States, in acknowledging and recognizing its violent colonial establishment, and hopefully to begin making some amends. But we still have a long way to go. Of course, these land acknowledgements for Native communities and nations, they're traditions dating back centuries, but for non-Indigenous communities sitting on land, it's a way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous people of the land on which we sit, and resisting the erasure of Indigenous histories and working towards honoring and inviting the truth. And as Professor Rabab explained, it's an important way to resist that erasure, to connect our struggles, and to just recognize historical injustices and begin to make amends. And part of it is, of course, this conference that we're attending in educating so that we can contribute ourselves to correcting historical injustices. And here I was asked to speak about apartheid in the law. And this can take many different forms. I made a few notes of some of the things I'd like to impart, but if there's anything that I neglect to say, hopefully we'll have time to address them in question and answer. Of course, as many of you know, to get really, really basic, apartheid is a word that was coined to mean apartness. It's in Afrikaans, and it refers specifically to the system of discrimination that was institutionalized and practiced by the government of South Africa from 1948 to the early 1990s. In the advocacy against apartheid, starting in 1952 all the way into 1990, apartheid was annually condemned by the United Nations General Assembly as being contrary to Articles 55 and 56 of the Charter of the United Nations. And starting after 1960, it was also regularly condemned by the United Nations Security Council. In 1966, the General Assembly labeled apartheid as a crime against humanity. And it took almost 20 years, but the Security Council later endorsed this determination. Significant and a milestone in the fight against apartheid was in 1973. The UN General Assembly adopted the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which is popularly referred to as the Apartheid Convention. And in that treaty, it declared that not only was apartheid unlawful because it violated the Charter of the United Nations, but that apartheid was also a crime against humanity. with a scope that extended beyond South Africa. It used the South Africa analogy to describe some of the actions that constitute apartheid, but it also went beyond. And then in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the crime of apartheid was included as a crime against humanity. And in that definition, all references to South Africa were eliminated. So the term is now defined globally as a crime against humanity. Of course, there are still some critics that would like to argue that apartheid was specific to South Africa and there is no apartheid or nothing like it that exists today. But I think the broader legal consensus is that it does exist to describe crimes like that were perpetrated by the apartheid South African regime, but that also extend beyond and can be applied to legally to situations that can exist today. So the crime of apartheid, there are a number of reasons, I think, why historically we have not, although Palestinians have been for a long time crying apartheid, we're only recently beginning to discuss it both popularly and legally. And I think that there are a few reasons for this, probably reasons that deserve a lot more studies, but I want to note them briefly. The South African legal scholar John Dugard, who also served as a UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, described a part of the problem as being the situation as it existed in South Africa, although while it was being perpetrated in South Africa, it was criminalized. The concept of apartheid and fighting it didn't take on a legal character. The global anti-apartheid struggle was framed in more moral and political terms and not legal language. And then with the collapse of the apartheid system in South Africa, you had certain UN treaty monitoring bodies that were suspended, and South Africa itself focused in its transition on truth and reconciliation rather than prosecuting those responsible for the crime of apartheid. So until this day, there have been no prosecutions for the crime of apartheid, although it has been declared a crime against humanity legally and in international criminal law since at least 1973. To date, there have been no prosecutions for the crime against apartheid. And so that makes it difficult to, as far as lawyers are concerned, and lawyers and jurists, to define certain terms that are used in defining apartheid remain undefined in legal jurisprudence. And that in turn, it's almost like a cycle, deters investigations and prosecutions because we don't know, well, does this qualify? And there is no law on this yet. So we have language that is included in the law as it's defined that still need to be defined, if you will. That I think is part of the reason, but not the whole reason, and certainly not anything that cannot be remedied, as there are more studies and legal material and academic material being produced on what can qualify and how certain terms can be defined. To give you just one example of one of these terms, that is racial grouping. In the definition of apartheid itself, it talks about being a crime when it is perpetrated by one racial group against another. Now, being that there has been no case based on a charge of apartheid, there's a lack of case law around the meaning of for example, racial grouping. Between Israelis and Palestinians, let's say they're not defined as separate races, and we all probably know that there is no such thing actually. Race is a social construction, and therefore in the law, what does this mean, and could it apply to Israel, being that the language of the law is stated in this way? I would argue that, and there are other legal scholars obviously that argue that looking more broadly at other legal sources that have criminalized crimes of the crime of apartheid and discrimination, and specifically I'll refer to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Race and racial discrimination have been broadly interpreted to include distinctions based on descent, national or ethnic origin, and other characteristics. So there are sources that can be referred to actually make that determination, even if it hasn't been determined by a court yet. And so it is a reason, but I don't think that it is the whole story. I want to refer to two other things briefly, and then move on to Israel's policies and maybe what legal recourses we have in the time that I have left. So we talked about the fact that there has been no prosecutions yet. Also, when it comes to Israel, I think that there has been, as we heard with the brilliant presentations before in the media and in academia, how there is this reluctance to criticize Israel and the forces that will jump on anyone with various accusations of anti-Semitism and otherwise if you dare to criticize Israel and Zionist policies. And there is this general notion that, of course, we've heard ad nauseum that Israel is a democracy. It's a Western democracy. It is the only democracy in the region. And so therefore, this notion that Israel is this Western democracy, it is the home of the Jewish people that have historically been victims, relating the state that's supposed to represent that to this widely condemned criminal regime of apartheid, there has been a mass reluctance to do that in general. Of course, it has been done in smaller areas, but in terms of more broadly, that reluctance is now being broken. But I think historically, that's also part of it. This notion of what Israel is has created this block into preventing people from looking at really what Israel was established to be and the crimes that it is committing. And then lastly, there's also, and I would say that legal scholars, even the Palestinian legal community, is partly to blame for the last reason. I think that we are only now seeing more talk about apartheid as a legal framework, is this occupation / two-state discourse. And it's a little more complicated and it will take a lot of time to get into it. But briefly, I just want to say that the way that Palestine has been framed, in that there was an armed conflict, Israel occupied, of course, Israel always disputed that it occupied any part of Palestine. It is now, as far as Israel was concerned, it was disputed territories. Palestinians were saying, no, we are occupied. And years have been spent on asserting this, Israel is an occupying power. I remember protesting back in Palestine in 2000 and holding in front of the international media a sign saying it's the occupation, stupid, because the media insisted also on Israel's framing of this being a dispute. This is disputed territory. And so therefore, in our own lexicon, and as far as we constrained ourselves to this international humanitarian law framework, which just focuses on the conduct of an occupying power and the protection of civilians in the context of international armed conflict or occupation. And in that context, we would violate Israel's crimes against, its collective punishment, the treatment of prisoners, the lack of freedom of movement and other things, but all within this constrained international humanitarian law framework, which also further constrained us to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, the situation of Palestinians inside Israel wasn't even discussed. The situation of Palestinian refugees was not included also in that, just the IHL, International Humanitarian Law Framework. And about a decade ago, I think the debate started within the Palestinian legal community about the fact that we are constraining ourselves by focusing just on IHL, and the fact that we need to broaden that. Of course, as I mentioned, criticism of using apartheid in general it still exists. There are those that argue, no, it was specific to South Africa. And while it is helpful to analogize sometimes, helps people make a connection, it is sometimes harmful to also make that connection, because people think, okay, apartheid is something in the past that was done, and then we'll have a hard time applying it to any other context. Whereas in popular, discourse and in our advocacy, I remember back in 2000 doing an interview, a radio interview from the occupied Palestinian territories, and I was on a radio show in South Africa with a South African anti-apartheid activist, and as I was describing the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, I think this was actually 2002, my South African counterpart was saying, what she is describing is worse than apartheid. Sure, the South African apartheid government put us in Bantustans, and there was this widespread discrimination, but they didn't then come and bomb with F-16s our Bantustans, which Israel was doing even back in 2002, and we saw even more egregiously with the various assaults on Gaza. They're putting us in cages, and then they're bombing us. So sometimes these analogies, it's apartheid, it's worse than apartheid, in our advocacy efforts, they're helpful. In the legal field, there is this debate, but I think I would say the losing side are those who are saying that it only applies, the crime against humanity and the crime of apartheid only applied in the South African context. And one of the, I think, easiest ways to show that it goes beyond South Africa is the fact that the crime of apartheid was included in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which went into force almost a decade after the end of apartheid in South Africa. So with all of that kind of background, where are we now? Of course, this year, the Israeli human rights organization VII came out with its report, finally calling the situation apartheid, and then the Human Rights Watch report, which came out in April, I think, of this year, also declaring the same. And I'm sorry, I missed the actual talk by Omar Shakir of International Human Rights Watch, where I think that he went into the various findings of Human Rights Watch and the considerations that inform their determination that Israel has crossed the line into apartheid. But I just want to name a couple of these policies that obviously fit the crime of apartheid. But before I do that, it might be helpful to actually recount, even though you might have heard it before, what the crime of apartheid and what the Rome Statute says. The crime of apartheid is inhumane acts of a character that are similar to those referenced, and there's a list which includes a murder and forced displacement and other things, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So various acts that could include creating separate residential areas, the persecution of persons opposed to apartheid, the dividing the population along racial lines, All of these are defined in the, the convention, the Apartheid Convention, and then also in the Rome Statute. What are some of Israel's most stark policies that need to be looked at and that are being looked at now as constituting or contributing to the determination that Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid is first and foremost, or not even foremost, but one of them being Israel's land policy. Israel's basic law, which it's kind of like its constitution, it mandates that land held by the State of Israel, the Israeli Development Authority, or the Jewish National Fund, this land shall not be transferred in any manner. So it is to remain permanently under this authority, and that is to prevent in any way that any part of the land that Israel claims as being belonging to Israel should be sold to anyone that is non-Jewish. And therefore, Israel maintains control of now like 93% of the land that is in the holding of the Jewish land, of what's called the Jewish Land Authority or the Israeli state. 93% of the land within the internationally recognized borders of what we call Israel, or what Palestinians called 1948 Palestine. And this law in Israel's basic law, it prohibits any political party in Israel's parliament, the Knesset, from even challenging from challenging it. Of course, it can be changed by I believe it's a 2/3 majority Knesset vote, but that is almost impossible to happen. Demographic engineering is another area of policy, which serves this purpose of maintaining Israel as a Jewish state. Most well known is the Israeli law that gives any Jew from anywhere in the world the right to enter Israel, obtain Israeli citizenship, irrespective of where they come from, whether or not they can show any links to Palestine or Israel. If they declare they're a Jew, they're not only welcome, given citizenship, but also given perks and incentives to come live in historic Palestine. Whereas Palestinians, of course, refugees, even those that can show that they have ancestral land, that they have a home, that they have a village, are prevented from returning. And some of these laws involving this demographic engineering, they're expressed sometimes in stark terms, but most of the time in this coded language. So where you can't actually say, oh, this is discriminatory on its face. For example, Israel has the admissions committee law, and this allows Jewish councils in over like 900 Jewish communities. It allows Jewish councils to reject applications from residents, specifically Palestinian citizens, from living there based on the fact that they're not socially suitable for the community. It doesn't specifically say Palestinians, but we know that that's who it's applied against. Palestinians are not socially suitable for this community, so they can be legally, by Israeli law, rejected from living in these communities. You have another law that is also not so stark on its face, but it applies to me personally, and I experienced it, whereas you can only pass your citizenship down one generation. So I was born in the United States, but my father is an Israeli citizen, and he was able to give me Israeli citizenship, and therefore I am an Israeli citizen. I cannot give that citizenship to my child if that child is born abroad. He or she has to be born, or I have to give birth to that child in Israel, which means the way that the law is worded, it doesn't say Palestinian or non-Palestinian, but effectively who it applies to is Palestinians, because of the other law that I mentioned, where any Jew anywhere in the world doesn't even have to have Jewish parents. They could just declare that they're Jewish and come claim rights to citizenship and land and other perks in Israel. So it only discriminates against Palestinians. And for me personally, when came time for me to have my child, I had to make a very difficult decision of travel to Israel to have my child there, so that I can ensure this paperwork for this child, so that Israel won't be in the future able to prevent my child from returning to our homeland and knowing our extended family, or giving birth where my husband can be with me, because of course Israel does not allow my husband to enter Palestine, Israel. And that was a difficult personal decision, but we chose as a family that I will give this paperwork, the citizenship, to my children so that my children can maintain connection to that land. But of course, millions of Palestinians do not have that right. Then you have the Bedouin community, citizens that are inside in Israel. Many of them served in the Israeli military. You have Israel massively demolishing their villages and removing them in order to replace these communities with Jewish towns. For example, El Araqib in April of just this year was demolished for the 186th time. You have the community of Al Hiran, another Bedouin community that Israel is evacuating to build the Jewish town of Hiran. Notice kind of the same names, but erasing the indigenous people there to blatantly replace it with Jewish communities as part of this demographic engineering. In Jerusalem, it is a known Israeli policy that they need to maintain a 70-30 demographic balance, 70% Jews to less than 30% of Palestinians, and therefore the policies that they have adopted in Jerusalem, well documented, including home demolitions, 50,000 home demolitions of Palestinians since 1967, the revocation of residency permits. Palestinians that live in Jerusalem only have residency cards, allowing them to stay there, but Israel can take those residency cards away from them at any time based on a range of reasons. And since 1967, Israel has revoked at least 15,000 residency cards from residents of Jerusalem, meaning they cannot come back. If a student was in the United States or in Turkey studying and failed to come back within a certain amount of time to renew their residency, suddenly they find themselves without right to re-enter Jerusalem, to re-enter Palestine, without having to get a visa from Israel. There is, of course, the forced displacement that we're seeing, the stealing of homes, as we're seeing in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan under the guise of the law. There's family separation, where there is the wall that has literally divided families from each other, making it very difficult for families to be able to stay on their land. This is all part of this demographic engineering. A lot more policies that we don't have time to go into, but okay, so now we have the situation where two major human rights organizations have finally come out and said, you know what, Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. Now what? What legal resources do Palestinians have to hold Israel accountable for this international crime? Apartheid is, many will argue, and I pause just because there are still those that argue that it is not so, but I think the overwhelming evidence is that it is what's considered a peremptory norm of customary international law, which creates obligations that are, in legal terms, erga omnes, which means it's an override. Sorry, Mama, quiet. It's these peremptory norms of international law means that no derogation is permitted from them. They're not based on specific treaties. They're not between states. They are customary international law, and the obligations that they create among states is binding on all states considered members of the international community, meaning states that, even the states that do not accede to the conventions, like the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, or even states that are not party to the Rome Statute, they still have an obligation to prevent and to cooperate to prevent violations of this peremptory norms of customary international law, of which apartheid, being an international crime, is one. Now, the Human Rights Watch has some recommendations. Some of them are good, but what we see is that even if we manage to even if we manage to have it determined, let me say that Israel is committing a crime of the crime of apartheid by a judicial body, you have the problem of enforcement, which is a problem that exists today. And it is a problem that goes back to how do you create the political will to ensure enforcement? And that is the link there. Between the law and enforcement of international law, there's got to be the will. And that's where our role, all of us, as you know, no matter what we do in our jobs, all of us have to be activists in changing the political configurations, the political considerations to make it more costly than not to be siding with the oppressor. As most of you know, we have now, Palestinians have managed to move the case against Israel in the International Criminal Court. So far as we know, as has been listed by the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the investigations will probably focus on 3 areas of war crimes. That's not to say that other crimes cannot then be investigated, and it is the job of course, the Palestinian legal community and other legal scholars to push that, and certainly international organizations like Human Rights Watch coming out with these reports lends impetus to the court to also go beyond what they have already delineated as areas that they will be looking into as far as crimes that Israel has committed. But it also has to be our movement in the streets, because there are pressures on the International Criminal Court, specifically in Western European countries, which mainly fund the court. If they start, and there is that kind of pressure now to drop Israel, or possibly be threatened with the court's funding. Of course, we know that the United States has its hand in this, but the more that we advocate, the more that we talk about it, the more that, as Rami has talked about, members of Congress now speaking up about it, the more that we make it understood that Israel is committing these crimes that we must all stand up against, the harder it will be for Israel to manipulate, and for Israel's defenders to be able to manipulate the judicial system to give Israel another pass. And even if we reach that time where it is determined that Israel has committed a crime, hopefully the power of the people to make sure that Israel is then the force of the international community in applying that pressure against Israel to dismantle its settler colonial apartheid regime will also be there. In the meantime, until the International Criminal Court takes us up, it moves very slowly. There are other things that can be done. One of them being moving this, trying to get a determination by the International Court of Justice, just like the Palestinians managed to do with the 2004 decision on the wall. The Human Rights Watch called for the appointment of a global UN envoy for the crimes of persecution and apartheid, and that would help also disseminate information and push for the end of these crimes wherever they occur. We could get the UN member states, could mandate an international commission of inquiry to also investigate systemic discrimination and repression based on group identity. So these are some of the things that can be done in the legal and political arena. But I go back also to our role, which has moved the needle so much, and with the tools available to us today. And I say our role, mean all of us as activists. Again, if we're lawyers, if we're teachers, if we're media professionals, we all have a role to play in advocating justice as activists. And that is where I will. Actually, one more point, and then I'll end by certainly encouraging everyone to continue speaking out, and wherever you are doing your role. But one thing that I recently tweeted about, and it got some attention specifically with regard to Israel's bombing of Gaza, but I think applies more widespread. It is now that we're talking about, oh, Israel's conduct may constitute the crime of apartheid. What about the crime of genocide, which Palestinians have been saying Israel is committing genocide? Whenever we're talking about crimes, we have to prove a crime, you have to look at intent, and proving intent is somewhat difficult. But there are ways to investigate what Israel's intentions are, and have been, like looking at its systematic and systemic policies from its inception until today of maintaining a Jewish majority. The statements of Israel's own leaders indicate that. So with apartheid, the intent has to be to maintain domination. With the crime of genocide, the intent has to be to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And I think it's not far-fetched to say that Israel's policies, especially when looking at the statements that are made by Israel's officials, military officials, and leaders, the people leading that country, that have basically called, just a tweet 2 days ago from Israel's official spokesperson, the spokesperson of the Israeli prime minister, insinuating that all Palestinian children are would-be terrorists. This is widespread dehumanization in language, which contributes to mass atrocities, which are usually prerequisites to genocidal policies. We have Israeli leaders calling us cockroaches and snakes, again, dehumanizing in order to justify Israel's massive rights violations. And so we've reached the point where we're looking at Israel now as an apartheid state, or committing the crime of apartheid. I don't think it's too far to also say, let's investigate also if Israel is guilty of the crime of genocide. And let me end there. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for everything that every single one of you is doing to bring these crimes closer to an end.
Thank you, Huwaida. Interesting. You answered some of the questions that came in, so I let you go over some time. We know as attorneys and also non-attorneys out there that enforcement is difficult. If there's no enforcement, there's no law. It seems that Israel acts with no accountability. People joke on the internet that if you want to commit murder, just say that you're Jewish and claim that the person that you killed is anti-Semitic. Just put on the magic yarmulke and you can murder who you want. And although this is a joke, it's in practical reality, it's not far from the truth of what's happening in Palestine. You can kill a child, no accountability. Bomb a building, no accountability. Cut off exports from Gaza to zero in a couple different years, no accountability. And I would agree with your argument that genocide charges could be brought. Even if proving intent is difficult, you can prove intent through action. When you cut off infrastructure, when you cut off water, when you cut off medical aid that you're obligated to give, I think intention of killing the entire population has become very clear. And the new prime minister as well has bragged about killing Arabs, and he's proud of his record. There you go. He's killing and he's proud of it. Going to questions for each of our panelists, let's start at the beginning as well. Professor Rabab, based on your experiences, we have a question forwarded to me. When you look back at how academic institutions have been treated since 9/11, how CIGA's director, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, was targeted wrongfully with ridiculous accusations against him, which have become subject of award-winning documentary, and persecution against Ward Churchill, Stephen Salita. Do you see that the situation today on campuses is better or worse?
Thank you. Well, first of all, actually, I do teach a documentary about Dr. Arian in my classes. So I think that I will say one thing, that we can actually compare every single experience. I don't want to engage in Operation Olympics, but I think each case in itself that people should not have been victimized, that there is no reason whatsoever for Dr. Sami Al-Aryan not to be in his campus in Florida and to be teaching. There is no justification whatsoever for Stephen Salaita not to be at his job at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign to continue teaching. It's not right. It's not acceptable. I think what's happening, actually, I think the situation is actually worse in the sense of the general environment, of the systematic aspects of it, not in terms of individuals. And I will say, why is that? For several reasons. One is that the more we speak up, and I think Rami was talking about, the more we speak up, the more we push back, the nastier they're going to get. I mean, this is something that actually, and it has to do with a couple of reasons. One is that Israel has this kind of like, presents itself as an exceptional case and thinks that it can get away with everything, including, not literally, but practically murder. Okay, so by the way, I just want to disagree with that joke, and I think that joke is actually quite problematic because it does not really, it basically does not account and invisibilizes many of our Jewish sisters and brothers who've fought a very long time with Palestine. They're part of the Palestinian liberation struggle, including many people who are here today. So I think, but I think they're going to get nastier. I think bullies never give up unless they are held accountable. On one hand, it's said in terms of legal aspects of it, we've actually been winning. I mean, we defeated them in the lawfare lawsuit, which was, they brought almost 1,000 lawyers, and the federal lawsuit for a year and a half, and the judge dismissed with prejudice. But then what they do is they went through the window, what they couldn't do through the door. So they went into backside battles. They didn't name me or any of the students in the lawsuit, their lawsuit that they filed and so on. And they basically cooked it and settled with the university behind our backs. But on the other hand, the lawsuit against the American Studies Association fell apart. They're trying to appeal, but we don't believe it's going to go anywhere. I don't want to talk about moral law because that's Waida's area, and you can speak about the various, cases that are going on. But I think it's sort of like the cost is really high. So I think what they're trying to do, the Zionists are trying to, and they've been doing historically with Dr. Aryan, with Stephen Salaita, with many people who spoke or who didn't speak. I mean, like I'm speaking up, but the cost is really high because what they're trying to do is they're saying, this is going to cost you. That's why we call it the new McCarthyism. It's going to cost you. You're going to do something like this. You're not going to get leave. You're not going to get sabbatical. Your classes are going to be cut. You're going to be forced to teach things that you actually don't want to teach. They're going to come up, and on campuses too, they're going to come up with all sorts of bureaucratic. I mean, for our students, for example, the university came up with a rule that you cannot have human voices above 75 decibels because the students went and protested the visit to campus by the racist mayor of occupied Jerusalem, Nir Barakat, in 2016. So when he was re-invited to campus by our university president, the students organized, so the university passed a rule that you cannot have even human voices above 75 decibels, not with bullhorn, not with a microphone. There is rules about who can meet. The university students, the associated students, passed a resolution that demands divestment from all companies that the university have relations to, that does business and reinforces Israeli occupation, colonialism, and apartheid. The university president wrote to the students, to the university student government elected, saying, I'm not going to honor that. I'm not going to implement the rule. Same thing happened with the University of Toronto, for example. Same thing is happening everywhere. So we see University of Toronto, the professor was actually fired. She was offered the job. Edward Said search at California State University, Fresno, was completely canceled. What we are seeing is that they are really, really frantic. They're really desperate. They're really desperate because they are failing, as we say, to hide the sun. They cannot hide what's going on. So they are resorting to a much more nasty intimidation, repressive tools in order to figure out anything under the sun, threaten your livelihood, try to get you fired, try to death threats, everything under the sun in order to get you up, because they really, really, and they have the resources. And one thing else is that I think if we think that all these calls, these violent calls and so on, are not dangerous. I think we need to see what happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C., with the coup that almost had, in which, by the way, there were multiple Israeli flags, just so we are very clear where the politics is and so on. This can happen. I mean, the thing is that unless we are building a big movement in order for us to all go together, not to be afraid, and this is easier, higher to an order to say, for people who are continuing to feel again and again and again the toll, and also the fact that you are actually being taken away from your own scholarship, from your own teaching, from the projects you want to do, and constantly being preoccupied, distracted, engaged in these useless, frivolous, but really nasty and real attacks. So I think they're really, I mean, they are, because they are at a much more frantic stage and so on, I think things are going to get worse. But I think we also have amazing people who are working together, and we should really just put our, the canceling, the deletion of the Ahmed Facebook page that we have years and hundreds of hours of pages of archives of online events and so on. That's really terrible, and that is as a result of the Zionist pressure. Are we able to get the Facebook page down? That will be bad. Will be like a huge thing that we could do, and as well as institutionalizing the program in all our universities, teaching courses, doing scholarship and so on, defying their silencing with our speaking out, with our activism, with our advocacy, scholarship, and legitimizing Palestine as a legitimate topic of scholarship and a legitimate topic of justice.
Thank you, Professor. Interesting to hear you believe things will get worse before they get better. Certainly, you see frantic actions by Israeli government and its cyber units as a response to activism on the ground showing what they're doing. And as some of our speakers have pointed out today and in the past 4 days, that people online are now seeing Israeli thugs for the first time, or again, realizing this isn't doctored, this isn't fake, this is live, what's happening is happening. Palestinians have been saying this for over 70 years, it's happening. As continuing censorship happens, this question for you, Rami, as continuing censorship happens in media platforms and papers and social media, do you see a effective response to this? If you're censored in every platform you move to, what's the response? Unmute, Rami, sorry.
So I don't think there's censorship on every platform, but on major ones, there certainly is. There really is no option other than to keep fighting back and coordinating. You know, one of the fascinating things about the Palestinian struggle today, and this was so obvious in the last 6 weeks, there are 4 global movements for justice that are truly global, that galvanize millions of people around the world in public events and whatever. Black Lives Matter, which is racial justice, the women's Me Too gender equity movement, the climate change environmental movement, and the Palestine cause. There are no other issues that generate as much consistent, intense, global activism as these movements. And one of the important things that's happening is the coordination among, say, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and Palestinian movements. These are movements for justice. And the more that people collaborate and coordinate and share notes and share strategies, legal, political, whatever they may be, media strategies, the more impact that they're going to have. But there's a big problem that we have as Palestinians, which is that we essentially don't have a government. We have no leadership. Most of the people here and all over the world are working on their own. Sometimes they're supported by an institution or a group or a wealthy patron who might fund an NGO or something. But the Israelis are working according to a major government-sponsored official program of global lies and distortions and obfuscation. I mean, one of the incredible things that I saw during the last month was every time when I was involved or other people were involved, I was watching, whenever a Palestinian would make a point, the pro-Israeli person would come back and start talking about Hitler or about how we treat our women, or, they completely changed the topic because they couldn't answer the accusation. They couldn't give a fact in response to the facts that we gave that showed that they are practicing apartheid and ethnic cleansing. So they changed the topic, and these old tactics don't work anymore. They haven't realized it, but still, as Rabab said, it's costly. Some people have lost their jobs. Sometimes you get intimidated. But I think all of us have learned. I've certainly been doing this since 1968 when I was a freshman at college in the United States. So I've learned over the years not to get intimidated, but just to stick to the truth. The only defense we have is the truth and the rule of law and historical accuracy. All other stuff, morality and human rights and these things, they may or may not matter. But if you have law and truth on your side, and you can mobilize widely, then you're going to succeed. But this needs real support, political as well as financial, as well as logistical support from governments. And we don't have a government. So the big imperative, I think, for Palestine activism for justice is the reconstitution, re-legitimization, and rebirth of a national political leadership. It may have happened with the elections that never took place. It's difficult to do. Everybody, I know Palestinians everywhere are discussing this. How do we do this? It's not easy when you're scattered all over the world. But there must be some coordinated mechanism that helps move this process forward more diligently and more efficiently. Because the potential for linking with global movements for justice is so enormous now, and all of the old roadblocks that the Zionists used to put in our way, all of them are either depleted or being depleted or weakening, and we have access to the media, we have access to public fora, we can talk to political leaders, we can do things, we can put signs on buses in London now that people couldn't do before. But the final point is those political leaders in London and Paris and Washington and Copenhagen and wherever they may be, the people sitting in government who make these decisions, how do they change the policies that they're pursuing? And that is a very slow process. But I'm also bolstered and heartened by when you look at the data among the demographic political data, young American Jews, young American evangelicals, young American students, labor unions, they just stopped some ships from unloading again in Oakland, and now they're looking at Canada. So the trend is absolutely in the favor of justice, and we are justice. So, I don't want to say the trend is pro-Palestinian. The trend is for justice. And the other thing to keep in mind, powerful as the Zionist movement is, and vicious and criminal and brutal and cruel as it is when they shoot skunk water at the Damascus Gate, it's unbelievable what they do. Their ability to be cruel and vicious is almost endless. But I keep remembering, the Americans were defeated in Vietnam. The Russians and the Americans had to leave Afghanistan. The colonialist rulers in most of the world left. The French, the British, however powerful you may be, however much political control you think you have, however much money and guns you have, you will eventually be defeated by a coordinated global movement for justice, peace, equality, and human dignity. I think there's no question about that. It takes time. It takes a long time. It took the Western world 500 years to go from the Magna Carta to the French Revolution, and then they needed another 200 years to give women the vote. So these things don't happen quickly, but the trends are what matter. So as a journalist and an analyst, I look at the trends rather than the setbacks only, and the trends are definitely in our favor, but we've got to work harder to coordinate our strengths and move this process forward to get to that point of justice. Thank you.
There's certainly a momentum of justice with efforts on campuses to decolonize. In question, Rawan, regarding this momentum of justice, you've made many documentaries. You had a colleague at Al Jazeera, Muna Hawa, who came under lots of pressure for some documentaries she did. Do you see that in the realm such as Al Jazeera that there's, with the momentum of justice, what type of censorship and pressure are you seeing against you as a filmmaker, as a documentary producer? Any experiences you can briefly share in threats that you face when you make such documentaries showing what's happening?
Thank you very much. Al-Nakba documentary that I did in 2008, it's translated now to 10 different languages, and many professors are using it in teaching about the story of Palestine. It's a 4 hours documentary about the story of Palestine from 1799 until today. It will never be shown on an American TV or a big festival in America or Canada at the moment. I've been sending this documentary to several festivals, and just the name Al-Nakba makes it enough to not showing in the States in, on an alternative media, in small festivals, with professors who are progressive and who want to teach about Palestine. They use it, but the censorship, I share with Rami the optimism that things changed. Inside the New York Times, we are witnessing different content in terms of opinion articles and other stories. But the main news, even in New York Times, is still the Zionist narrative, even if not the traditional one, the new one. And I think we gained spaces in the Western world, in Europe in particular, and to a lesser extent in the States and in Canada, but we lost big chunks in the Arab world, which is with the normalization, phenomena that is reaching Morocco, Sudan, the GCC, the Arabic language media left the Palestinian story big time since 2011. Less and less have been covering, the story of Palestine in depth. Yes, the few weeks in the news, Palestine came back to the agenda after a long time that it wasn't in the news, in the Arabic language, in the pan-Arab media, from broadcasters to newspapers and websites. I'm still worried that with the GCC different, geopolitics that is going along, even with what's happening concerning Egypt, we will have less platforms in Arabic language to speak about Palestine for a wider audience. And this makes the social media more important. And this makes the ban inside something like Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and even YouTube and Twitter, a new battle that we need to fight in Arabic language, because the Zionist movement and Israel in particular did during the last 10 years, misinformation, disinformation in small pieces in Arabic language that are not the big lies to say to the people that there's a lie there, but it was, very slowly. And a professor in London, estimated that it was a 2 billion budget that took place during the last 10 years just for the misinformation, malinformation, disinformation that was implemented. So there is a big mechanism against us. All my documentaries, I did one about owners of the land, the Palestinians inside Israel, the 2 million people that proved in the last few months that without them, the Palestinian project will never succeed. I'm very glad that at least, in the past, we used to say to people that Palestinians in Nazareth facing the same discrimination as Palestinian in Jerusalem and in Hebron and in Gaza, and people didn't get it at that time, that what we are talking about. And now with all what happened in Palestine, it became again historic Palestine. But there is a big, Oslo Accords Nakba that came to us, and maybe this is why I did, the Price of Oslo documentary. But it's still there, and we need to face this, that we don't have a political leadership that is leading Palestinian people at the moment. And I'm not sure if we need to wait for this leadership to come, or the street grassroots movement is moving much quicker than any political leadership can move at the moment. I am optimistic, but the situation in the Arab world and the Arab countries around Palestine, with more and more suppression to information and more less rule of law, hinders our movement. Any liberation movement inside Palestine is really faced by Arab governments around who don't want to support this global justice movement.
Thank you, Ruwan. Huwaida, I've been instructed to give you a 1-minute question. This might be the impossible task, like presenting to a court. What will it take do you think that American law will ever be used and implemented and enforced against Israel? We see how UN sanctions, one sanction with false accusation was applied against Iraq, which was bombed to oblivion. Yet in 2018, when over 180 sanctions were brought against Israel, there's no enforcement. Do you think that the law will ever be enforced against Israel? Will it take George and Amal Clooney? What will it take? 1 minute.
Yeah, that is kind of impossible. We've had some victories in the law, as Professor Rabab mentioned. Also, recently, for example, there was a lawsuit against a friend to try to sue her for, I think it was $6 million for defamation for a post she had on Facebook, and that lawsuit was thrown out of court. We have victories that are being achieved across states when challenging the laws preventing or imposing consequences for engaging in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. On that level, there have been victories in U.S. courts using U.S. law and the First Amendment primarily. I think you're more referring to when we're trying to hold Israel accountable and Israeli officials, for example, for torture, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And I was a part of a couple of those lawsuits that were not successful. What ends up happening is that the courts decide that this is a political question that is not justiciable in U.S. courts. What they usually do sometimes before that is solicit the opinion of the government, of the State Department, saying, if we hear this case, if we rule on this, is that going to infringe upon your power or your domain of engaging in international relations and conducting foreign policy? And the State Department usually comes in and says yes, and recommends that the court not hear these. Will that ever change? I think, as I said before, we have to kind of work on creating the political will. I think there will be a tipping point when the voices for justice are so loud, for freedom for Palestine are so loud, that it will become harder for the U.S. to intervene in the various ways that it has intervened to protect Israel and to provide the impunity to Israel that it has so far. So I think that we will get there. And if we get to a point where the State Department does not interfere and say, yes, don't hear this court, I think the facts will bear out that we will hopefully, inshallah, find courts finding Israeli leaders guilty of the crimes charged.
Thank you, Huwaida. Well done. We'll summarize our session. Each panelist take 30 seconds to 1 minute to our listeners, remembering that videos will be posted on YouTube for the future and spread widely and analyzed and attacked. What message do you have on behalf of Palestine, Palestinians abroad? What's your message to listeners, each of you? Professor Rabab.
Yes. First of all, I thank you again. I want to re-emphasize that we're talking about systemic. We're talking about structures. We're not talking about accidental, isolated, or random things that are happening with the Israel lobby industry, which is our topic. I believe that we really need to continue speaking truth to power, researching, teaching, advocating. I think we really need to continue legitimizing and discussing about how really it's important to legitimize the anti-colonial narrative of resistance and existence of the Palestinian people. I want to also say that we have multiple publics, that the publics we are reaching, some of them are actually sort of like the average quote unquote Joe Schmo on the street, or Joe the plumber or whatever, but there are also many publics who have stood by Palestine for a very, very long time. I'm talking about Mr. Rami spoke about Black Lives Matter. Indigenous communities have not given up on Palestine in every single struggle they have conducted, from Standing Rock to Wounded Knee to Mauna Kea to Idle No More. Every single time Palestine is always present, and there is always affirmation of that. Movement for Black liberation, the anti-Asian violence movement that actually has been there, the Latinx movement, people who are opposing the border, women's movement has actually expanded again and again. And this is why we're actually seeing, and the unions, of course, and the labor, this is why we're seeing the attacks that we are seeing. This is why it's really, really important not only to organize, and as a Palestinian, I would say to organize for a new leadership and for a different kind of leadership than to revamp what Palestinian liberation, anti-colonial liberation means. But it's really, really also for us to fight for institutionalizing the studies that we're doing, for making sure that the new generations are actually able to learn in order for that to dispel the myths, to speak truth for power, to continue what's going on. So I will ask everybody also to support us, stand by us, continue telling the story, demanding that we don't get silenced, don't get shut down. We're speaking, and we rely on all of you in order for us to achieve the indivisibility of justice.
Thank you, Professor Rabab. Rami, 30 seconds. If a bomb is coming down on top of you in Gaza, what's the last thing you want to say to people in the 20 seconds before you grab your document bag and run?
Based on the last century, I would say document everything, keep copies of everything, keep several copies digitally. Of course, it's easy. So as Zionism tries to destroy our existence and any record of our existence, we have more records than they can destroy. And collaborate closely with more and more people as much as you can, and keep sticking to the facts and the truth, and we will prevail. There's no doubt about it.
Well said. Yes, document everything. Ms. Rawan Daman, 20 seconds. What do you have to say to everyone for next steps?
Each one of us can be a Palestine ambassador. You need to have the knowledge and the skills and initiate this. If you need to have knowledge audiovisual, check palambassador.org. It's available in Arabic, English, and Spanish. Al-Nakba documentary is even available in Turkish language. You need to have the detailed knowledge and the skills, and then surely we will prevail.
Well done. And Huwaida, thank you for your contributions. I'd like to have a panel with you in the future talking more about legal steps forward. Any last statement to make very quickly?
Sure. I thank you very much, and I would welcome that. I would just say that, first of all, let me echo everything that these wonderful panelists have said. I agree wholeheartedly. And as far as the law is concerned, the law is a tool. It is one of many tools that we have in our arsenal. And sometimes we're going to lose in the courtroom, but then we use those opportunities of loss to educate and to mobilize, to move the streets, to push so that we can get back in the courtroom, and eventually we'll see a win. The lawyers are supporting the activists in the streets, and the activists supporting the lawyers, and together we create the political will that we need to advance justice. So not to be disheartened, justice is on the horizon.
Well done, thank you. Yeah, it's in pieces. Justice is eventually coming, as faster than Kafia's printed and canceled by Louis Vuitton. Justice is coming, so we will do it. Our next session begins, everyone, in 13 minutes. Today is day 4 of the session, which continues tonight. It will be moderated by Leila Al-Arian. on the topic of Israel, the U.S., and the apartheid industry, continuing the conversation about U.S. foreign policy, its impact on Palestine, understanding the struggle against white supremacy and Zionism, which is a supremacist movement. It's a far-right movement that has hijacked Judaism, just like the far right in the U.S. tried to hijack the Capitol. Zionism is a far-right movement that needs to be seen for what it is. The unholy alliance exposing U.S. right-wing movements and supporting the Israeli apartheid and policing and the security state, unmasking Israel's role. Thank you, everyone, for attending on behalf of CIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs. We will take a quick break, Fasl and Wasl break, and return in 10 minutes. Thank you, everyone.